The morning air bit sharp against his skin, the kind of cold that slips through layers of clothing like it's got a personal mission. He sat on the edge of a cracked concrete bench near the old bus station, the one that hadn't seen a working schedule in over a year. Around him, the city stirred awake. Delivery trucks rumbled, shop owners rolled up their metal grates, and commuters hurried past with steaming cups in hand, eyes locked on their phones or the next train. Nobody looked at him. Not really. To most, he was just part of the scenery, like a broken street lamp or a faded poster peeling off a wall. He'd been awake since before sunrise. Sleep never came easy anymore. Not on cardboard, not with the wind howling between alley walls, not with the constant hum of sirens in the distance. But he didn't complain. Complaining hadn't gotten him anywhere in a long time. Instead, he kept his coat zipped tight, his hands tucked into his sleeves and his eyes on the ground. The coat was old, frayed at the cuffs, but it had once meant something. On the left shoulder, barely visible under years of grime and patchwork stitching, was a small American flag, faded blue, threadbare red and white. He never took it off, even in summer. It was the last thing that still felt like his. A police cruiser rolled slowly down the street, its tires crunching over broken glass and scattered trash. He didn't flinch. He'd seen them before. Sometimes they'd nod, sometimes they'd tell him to move along, sometimes they'd just drive past like he wasn't there. But today the car stopped. Two officers stepped out, boots clicking on the pavement. One was young, with a stiff posture and a radio clipped to his shoulder. The other was older, with tired eyes and a slight limp. "Sir," the younger one said, voice firm but not unkind, "you can't be here. This is private property." He looked up slowly. His face was lined with years, his beard streaked with gray. But his eyes were clear, calm, steady, like someone who'd seen too much to be rattled by a routine warning. "I wasn't causing trouble," he said quietly. "Just resting." "We've had complaints," the older officer said, glancing toward the boarded-up station. "You've been here 3 nights in a row." He nodded. He knew, he'd counted them. 3 nights under the overhang, out of the rain, away from the worst of the wind. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. "Come on," the younger officer said, stepping closer. "We'll take you to the warming center downtown." He shook his head. "They turned me away last week. Said I didn't have ID. You got any ID on you now?" He patted his pocket slowly, pulling out a worn wallet. Inside was a crumpled Social Security card, a folded photo of a younger man in uniform standing beside a woman and a child, and an expired driver's license from another state, over a decade old. The photo barely resembled him now. The officers exchanged a look. The older one sighed. "Look, we don't want to do this, but if you don't move, we have to cite you for trespassing." He didn't argue. He stood slowly, joints stiff from the cold. He gathered his few belongings, a rolled-up blanket, a plastic bag with a toothbrush and a half-empty water bottle, a small notebook with pages filled in careful handwriting. As he stood, the flag patch on his coat caught the morning light for just a second. The younger officer hesitated. You ever serve?" He gave a small nod. "Long time ago." No follow-up question came. No salute, no handshake, no thank you for your service. Just a nod, and then the cuffs, cold metal clicking around his wrists. Not tight, not rough, but final. He didn't resist. He'd been trained to follow orders once. Old habits die hard. At the precinct, the process was routine, fingerprinted, photographed. Asked the same questions over and over. Name, date of birth, address? He gave his name clearly, but when asked for an address, he just said, "Don't got one right now." The desk sergeant typed it in as homeless, like it was a location on a map. No one asked about the military. No one checked his records. The system wasn't built for stories, it was built for files, codes, checkboxes. And in that system, he was just another case number, another body to process before lunch. His public defender, a tired-looking man with coffee stains on his tie, met him an hour later in a holding room. They had 10 minutes. The lawyer flipped through the thin file. "Loitering and trespassing," he said. "First offense. Probably just a fine or community service. But you got any ID? Proof of veteran status? Could help with alternatives." He shook his head. "Lost most of my papers when I lost my apartment. Tried to get replacements, but..." He trailed off. The VA office had sent him in circles for months. Without a fixed address, without a phone, without someone to advocate for him. The doors kept closing. The lawyer nodded, not unsympathetically, but with the weary resignation of someone who'd heard it all before. All right. We'll plead not guilty, ask for leniency. Court date's in 3 days. 3 days later, he was led into the courtroom in the same clothes, unwashed, unshaven, still wearing that old coat. His hands were cuffed in front this time, not behind, small mercy maybe. He kept his gaze down as he walked, not out of shame, but because he'd learned long ago that looking people in the eye when you're at the bottom only invites more trouble. The room buzzed with the usual morning chaos, clerks shuffling papers, lawyers whispering to clients, the low hum of anxiety and boredom mixed together. He was seated in the defendant's chair, the wood cold beneath him. He didn't fidget. He didn't speak. He just waited, like he'd waited for buses that never came, for calls that never rang, for help that never arrived. The bailiff called his name, full name, clear and official. It echoed off the high ceilings, bouncing off marble and wood and glass. And somewhere in that room behind the bench, a woman in a black robe heard it. Really heard it. But that moment, the shift, the gasp, the silence that followed was still a few seconds away. For now, he was just a man in a courtroom, tired, forgotten, carrying a lifetime of service in his bones and a flag on his shoulder, wondering if today would be the day someone finally saw him. Not as a problem, not as a statistic, but as a person. Outside, the city kept moving. But inside that courtroom, something was about to change. Not because of a law, not because of a policy, but because of a name. A name that still meant something to someone. And sometimes that's all it takes. The courtroom smelled like old wood coffee and the faint tang of nervous sweat. It was one of those municipal courtrooms that saw more traffic violations than trials. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, plastic chairs bolted to the floor, a water cooler in the corner that never seemed to work. The judge sat high above everyone else, behind a wide wooden bench that looked like it had been there since the city was built. She was in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled back neatly and glasses perched low on her nose. Her expression was calm, practiced, the kind that came from decades of listening to people explain why they ran red lights or forgot to pay parking tickets. She flipped through the morning's docket with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Most days blurred together, small offenses, small consequences, small lives passing through like leaves in a gutter. She treated each case with fairness but also with speed. There was a line out the door after all. Then came the next name, the people versus full name, the bailiff announced. Voice echoing slightly in the half-full room. She read the name off the paper without looking up at first. Standard procedure, but halfway through her eyes flickered. She paused. Read it again, slower this time. Something about those syllables, how they landed, how they fit together, pulled her back. Not just to a file or a case, but to a memory, a real one, sharp and sudden like a photograph flipping open in her mind. She lifted her head. There, standing in the defendant's box, was a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His coat was worn thin, his shoes cracked at the sole, his hands resting loosely in front of him, cuffed but not tense. He didn't look angry, didn't look defiant, just tired, deeply, bone-achingly tired. But it was his eyes that caught her. Steady. Quiet. The kind of eyes that had seen things most people never would, and carried them without complaint. She leaned forward slightly, fingers resting on the edge of the bench. Mr. Last name, she said, her voice softer than usual. Were you stationed at Fort Bragg in the early 1980s? A ripple went through the room. The public defender, who'd been scribbling notes, looked up. The prosecutor paused mid-sip of coffee. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a second. The man in the box blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected to be asked a question like that. Not here, not now. He nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor, from 81 to 85, and were you part of the 82nd Airborne? Another nod. Yes, ma'am. She didn't move for a long moment. Then, very quietly, she said, Do you remember a lieutenant named Daniel Whitmore? This time his eyes widened just a fraction. He searched her face, not with fear but with dawning recognition. You're his sister? She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her throat tightened. She cleared it gently, but the room had already gone still. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. Yes, she said. He talked about you every year. Said you pulled him out of a training ditch during a live fire exercise when his leg got pinned under equipment. Said you stayed with him in the mud for 2 hours until medics came. Even though you weren't supposed to be there, you'd finished your rotation, but you stayed to help. The man looked down for a second as if the memory weighed heavy. He was bleeding bad, he said simply. Couldn't leave him. You saved his life, she said, voice thick now. He told me that for years. Said you never asked for anything in return. Just walked away like it was nothing. He shook his head. It wasn't nothing, but it was my job. She took a slow breath. Then, without warning, she stood up. The entire courtroom tensed. Judges didn't just stand mid-case unless something serious was happening. But instead of calling for order or declaring a recess, she turned to face the room. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, her voice clear and strong now, carrying to every corner. This man standing before you isn't just another defendant. He's a decorated veteran. He served 2 tours overseas. He received the Soldier's Medal for heroism, not for fighting, but for saving a fellow soldier's life in peacetime. And that soldier was my brother. A stunned silence fell. You could hear someone's pen drop. Then from the back, a bailiff, a broad-shouldered man with a Marine Corps tattoo peeking from his sleeve, stood up. Not because he was told to, just because he felt he should. Then the court clerk rose. Then the prosecutor. Then the public defender. One by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, everyone in the room got to their feet. Even the 2 people waiting for their own traffic cases stood, not entirely sure why, but sensing this was something bigger than procedure. The man in the defendant's box looked around, bewildered. His eyes filled, not with tears, not exactly, but with something deeper. Something like disbelief mixed with relief, like he'd been invisible for so long and suddenly in this cold, fluorescent room someone had truly seen him. The judge stepped down from the bench. Not all the way, just enough to be on the same level. She walked slowly toward him, her robe whispering against the floor. Do you have a place to stay? She asked quietly. He shook his head. Not right now. Are you getting the help you need? Medical, housing, support? He gave a small, sad smile. Tried. Hard to get through the doors when you don't got an address, don't got a phone, don't got much of anything, she nodded. Then she turned to the prosecutor. Are you pressing charges? The prosecutor, still standing, hesitated only a second. Your Honor, no, absolutely not. Then this case is dismissed, she said firmly, with prejudice. A murmur ran through the room, not of disappointment but of quiet approval. But she wasn't done. She turned back to the man. You're not alone, she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear clearly. Not anymore, he didn't say anything. Just nodded, his jaw tight. But his shoulders, hunched for so long under the weight of being forgotten, seemed to straighten just a little. Outside the courtroom, life went on as usual. Cars honked. People rushed to lunch. But inside, something rare had happened. Not justice exactly, though that was part of it, but something more human. Recognition. Respect. The kind that doesn't come from a policy or a program, but from one person remembering another's name and what it meant. And as the man stepped out of the cuffs, accepted a tissue from the court clerk, and was gently guided toward a side office where someone would finally listen to his whole story, the room stayed standing for a long time, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because sometimes the right thing to do isn't written in law. It's written in how we treat each other when no one's watching. Except this time, everyone was watching. And they'd never forget what they saw. News travels fast when it carries heart. By lunchtime, someone in the courthouse had recorded a short clip, just 10 seconds of the judge standing, the room rising, the quiet moment that followed. They didn't post it with a headline or dramatic music, just a shaky phone video with the caption, "This happened in court today." Within an hour, it had been shared thousands of times. By evening, local news vans were parked outside the courthouse, reporters trying to piece together who the man was, where he'd gone, what had led him there. But no one had his full story yet, just fragments. Veteran, homeless, wrongfully charged, recognized by a judge who knew his name. The judge didn't give interviews. She asked the court staff to respect the man's privacy. But that only made people more curious and more moved. Strangers began calling the courthouse, the local VA office, even the police department, asking, "How can we help him?" Meanwhile, he wasn't at a shelter or back on the streets. He was sitting in a small, warm office down the hall from the courtroom, wrapped in a donated blanket, holding a paper cup of hot coffee that someone had quietly placed in his hands. A social worker from the county's Veterans Outreach team had been called in, someone who actually knew how to navigate the maze of benefits, housing programs, and medical records that had shut him out for years. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't being rushed. He wasn't being told not today or come back with more paperwork. He was being listened to. "I lost everything after my wife got sick," he said, voice low but steady. "Medical bills, the house. Then my own health started failing. Bad back, PTSD they never really treated. I tried staying with friends, but you can't lean on people forever." The social worker nodded, taking notes not like a bureaucrat but like someone who'd heard this song before and knew every verse. "We're going to get your records pulled today," she said. "Your discharge papers, your service history, your VA file. Once we have that, we can fast-track housing, healthcare, even a stipend for essentials." He looked at her, not with hope exactly. Hope had been worn thin, but with something close to cautious trust. "You sure they'll listen this time?" "I'll make sure they do," she said. That night, he didn't sleep under a bridge or in a doorway. He stayed in a temporary room at a veterans transition center. Clean sheets, a locked door, a hot shower. He stood under the water for a long time, letting the steam loosen the knots in his shoulders, washing away more than just dirt. The next morning, his story broke wide open. A local news anchor, herself an Army veteran, shared the courtroom video on her personal page with a simple message. "This is why we say, never forget." But remembering isn't just about parades. It's about making sure our people don't fall through the cracks. Donations poured in. A retired firefighter started a GoFundMe, not for himself, just for the veteran from the courtroom. He wrote, "If you've ever worn a uniform, or loved someone who did, you know how thin the line is between stability and the street. Let's give them a real second chance." By noon, they'd raised $20,000. By midnight, over $150,000. People gave $5, $20, $100, along with messages. "Thank you for your service. My dad was like you, wish someone had helped him. You deserve dignity." But the most unexpected visitor came the following afternoon. The judge arrived not in her robe, not with a camera crew, but in a simple coat and scarf, carrying a manila envelope. She found him in the common room of the center, sitting by a window with a book someone had given him. He stood when he saw her. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I wanted to," she replied. She sat beside him, not across from him, side by side like equals. Then she opened the envelope and pulled out a faded photograph. In it, a young lieutenant with a wide grin stood arm in arm with a younger version of the man beside her, both in fatigues, mud on their boots, sun on their faces. "My brother kept this on his desk his whole life," she said softly. "He wrote you a letter once after he got out. Tried to send it, but your address had changed. He never knew if you got it." She handed him a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, sealed in plastic. He opened it slowly, hands trembling just slightly. The handwriting was neat, earnest. "You didn't just save my leg that day, you saved my future. I got to marry the love of my life, raise 2 kids, watch my daughter graduate college. None of that happens if you walk away. I'll never be able to repay you, but I promise I'll never forget you. Thank you, brother." He read it twice, then folded it carefully and held it against his chest. "I didn't know," he whispered. I thought no one remembered." "I remembered," she said. "And now, thanks to that moment in court, so does everyone else." They sat in silence for a while, watching rain patter against the window. No grand speeches, no cameras, just 2 people connected by a thread of history, loss, and gratitude. Later that week, the city's mayor called. A nonprofit offered him a fully furnished apartment in a building reserved for veterans, with on-site counseling and job placement help. A local tailor volunteered to make him a new suit. A barber gave him a shave and a haircut, refusing payment. But what mattered most wasn't the money or the apartment or even the public attention. It was the look in people's eyes when they spoke to him now. Not with pity, not with suspicion, but with respect. With recognition. He started going to the VA not as a nameless file, but as someone they knew. Nurses greeted him by name. Doctors listened. Therapists didn't rush him through sessions. And slowly, the weight he'd carried for years, the invisible weight of being unseen, began to lift. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person saying, "I know who you are," to remind someone they still matter. And once that spark is lit, it doesn't just change one life. It lights a path for others, too. The days after the ruling should have felt like victory. And in many ways they were. Ms. Ruiz got her apartment back, this time with working heat, hot water, and a signed agreement that Crestline would never try to evict her again. The local paper ran a short piece about the case, calling it a quiet win for tenant rights. A few legal blogs mentioned the recusal motion as a textbook example of professional courage. But the young lawyer didn't celebrate. She knew better than to think the story was over, because while the courtroom battle had ended, the real reckoning was just beginning. And it wasn't hers. Judge Wainwright didn't return to the bench the following week. Rumors swirled. He was on medical leave, he'd requested reassignment, he was retiring early. But the truth was simpler and more human. He was ashamed, not the kind of shame that makes someone lash out, but the kind that sits heavy in your chest whispering, "You were wrong." And everyone saw it. He'd spent decades believing he was fair, that his experience gave him clarity. But watching that young woman stand her ground, not with anger, not with showmanship, but with quiet, unshakable competence, had cracked something open inside him. He'd mistaken youth for inexperience, calmness for weakness, and humility for uncertainty, and in doing so, he'd nearly denied justice to someone who needed it most. One rainy afternoon, he found himself sitting in his study, staring at a blank legal pad. He'd tried writing an apology, but the words felt hollow. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound like damage control? "Sorry I mocked you for looking young while you were trying to keep an elderly woman from freezing in the streets?" No, that wasn't enough. Instead, he did something harder. He signed up for the State Judicial College's workshop on implicit bias, something he'd always dismissed as soft training for people who can't handle real law. He sat in the back of the room, listening as younger judges and court staff shared stories about being underestimated, interrupted, or ignored, not because of their arguments, but because of how they looked, spoke, or carried themselves. It hit him like a punch to the gut. Meanwhile, the young lawyer kept working. She turned down interview requests. She didn't post about the case online. She knew that real change didn't happen in headlines. It happened in courthouses and tenant meetings, in late-night strategy sessions with overworked paralegals and volunteers who believed housing was a human right, not a privilege. But then came an unexpected invitation. The State Bar Association asked her to speak at their annual judicial ethics seminar. Not as a wunderkind or a curiosity, but as a practicing attorney who'd navigated a real ethical dilemma with professionalism and grace. She almost said no. She hated being put on display. But then she thought of Ms. Ruiz, of all the clients who'd been talked over, dismissed, or made to feel small just for showing up. Maybe her voice could help shift something. Not just in courtrooms, but in the minds of the people who ran them. The day of the seminar, she wore the same simple blouse she'd worn in court. No performance, just presence. She didn't tell her story like a hero's journey. She spoke plainly. "I've been told I look too young to be a lawyer more times than I can count. At first I tried to dress older, speak louder, carry a bigger briefcase, but that wasn't me. And it didn't fix the problem, it just made me exhausted." She paused, looked out at the room full of judges, court administrators, and senior attorneys. "The real issue isn't how I look. It's the assumption that competence has a uniform, that wisdom only comes with gray hair, that someone who speaks softly doesn't know the law code. Those assumptions don't just hurt lawyers like me. They hurt the people we represent. Because when a judge doubts your counsel, they doubt your client's truth." A few judges nodded. Others looked down at their notes, thoughtful. She ended with this: "I don't want special treatment. I just want the same chance to be heard, fully, fairly, without my age or appearance coloring the room before I say a word. And I believe every person who walks into a courtroom deserves that, whether they're wearing a suit or slippers." Afterward, several judges approached her, not to praise her, but to ask questions. "How do we catch our own biases?" one asked. "What should we do when we realize we've been unfair?" asked another. She answered honestly. "Start by listening. Really listening. Not to respond, but to understand. And when you're wrong, own it. Quietly, humbly, and then do better." Back in his office, Judge Wainwright read a transcript of her talk. sent to him anonymously, slipped under his door. He read it twice. Then he picked up his pen and wrote a letter, not to her, but to the local bar journal. He didn't mention her by name. He didn't recount the courtroom scene. Instead, he wrote about a moment of failure he'd experienced recently, a moment when his assumptions clouded his judgment. He wrote about the danger of mistaking confidence for competence and youth for inexperience. He admitted that fairness isn't just about following rules. It's about constantly questioning your own lens. I spent years believing I was impartial, he wrote, until someone younger, quieter, and far wiser than I gave me a mirror, and in it I saw not a bad judge but a human one. And humans can change. The piece was published 2 weeks later. It didn't go viral, but it was passed around courthouses, law schools, and legal aid offices. People talked about it in hushed, respectful tones, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. The young lawyer read it over coffee one morning. She didn't smile. She didn't feel vindicated. She just felt seen, not as a prodigy or a punchline, but as a person doing her job with integrity. And that was enough. Later that week, she visited Ms. Ruiz to drop off the final paperwork. The old woman's apartment was warm now, filled with the smell of soup and fresh laundry. A small space heater hummed in the corner just in case. "You changed things," Ms. Ruiz said, handing her a cup of tea. "No," the young lawyer replied. "We did. You had the courage to speak up. I just made sure someone listened." As she walked home through the crisp evening air, she thought about how justice isn't a single moment, a ruling, a headline, a standing ovation. It's a chain of small choices. To listen when it's easier to assume, to question yourself when it's safer to stay certain, to keep showing up even when the system wasn't built for you. She didn't need the world to call her a genius. She just needed it to give her clients a fair shot. And slowly, quietly, that was starting to happen. Months passed and the courthouse settled back into its usual rhythm. The buzz around the case faded as these things do. New disputes came in, evictions, custody battles, small claims, and the old ones slipped into file folders, then archives. But some ripples don't disappear. They just spread quietly like rings in still water. The young lawyer kept working out of her modest office on the edge of the city. The walls were lined with bookshelves crammed with legal texts, community resource guides, and framed thank you notes from clients, handwritten in shaky cursive or bright crayon from kids whose families got to stay in their homes. She still carried the same worn satchel, still drank coffee from the same chipped mug, still showed up early and stayed late. She never mentioned the courtroom incident unless asked, and even then she redirected the conversation. "It wasn't about me," she'd say. "It was about making sure the law worked for someone who needed it most." But others remembered. Law students started reaching out, not for autographs or stories, but for advice. How do you stay calm when they don't take you seriously? One asked during a clinic visit. She smiled. You don't try to prove them wrong in the moment. You let your work speak. And you keep showing up, better prepared, more compassionate, and twice as ready. She began mentoring more young attorneys, especially those who didn't fit the old mold, the ones with accents, with caregiving responsibilities, with student debt and second jobs. She taught them that professionalism wasn't about sounding like a textbook. It was about showing up with integrity, even when no one expects you to. Meanwhile, Judge Wainwright returned to the bench, but differently. He still ran a tight courtroom, but now he paused before interrupting. He made a point to read every filing thoroughly, even from solo practitioners or legal aid lawyers. And when a young attorney appeared before him, especially one who looked nervous or out of place, he'd say gently, "Take your time. The court is listening." He never spoke to the young lawyer again, and she never expected him to. But once, months later, he ruled in favor of a tenant represented by a fresh-out-of-law-school advocate who'd stumbled through her opening statement. After the hearing, he quietly told the clerk, "Make sure she gets a copy of the ruling with a note. Well-reasoned. Keep going." It was his way of paying it forward. Back in her office one rainy evening, the young lawyer sat at her desk, reviewing a new case, a single mother facing eviction after her hours were cut. The landlord claimed she'd violated her lease by having a guest stay too long. But the guest was her teenage son, home from college during break. The lease said nothing about visitors. It was clearly retaliation for her complaints about black mold. She sighed, rubbed her eyes, and opened a fresh legal pad. Same as always, no fanfare, no spotlight, just another person counting on someone to stand in their corner. Her phone buzzed. A message from a former client. "My heat's working. Thank you for fighting for us when no one else would." She smiled faintly and typed back, "Just doing my job." But it was more than a job. It was a promise to herself, to her grandmother who'd cleaned houses for 40 years and never owned one, to every person told they didn't belong in a room where decisions were made about their lives. Later that week, she visited a community center to speak at a housing rights workshop. No podium, no microphone, just a circle of folding chairs and a room full of tired, worried faces. She didn't talk about court victories. She talked about rights, how to document repairs, how to write a formal complaint, how to know when you're being retaliated against. Afterward, a woman approached, eyes red from crying. "They're trying to evict me too," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone would care." "I care," the young lawyer said simply. "Come by the office tomorrow. We'll figure it out together." That night, as she walked home under streetlights flickering on in the drizzle, she thought about how change rarely comes with fireworks. It comes in small acts of courage, showing up when you're told you're too young, too soft, too different. It comes in judges who learn to listen, in tenants who refuse to be silenced, in lawyers who believe the law should protect everyone, not just the powerful. She passed a bus stop where a woman wrapped in a thin coat held a child close. She thought about Ms. Ruiz, now safe in her warm apartment. She thought about the students she mentored, the cases she'd lost and won, the quiet dignity of doing right by people even when no one's watching. Back home, she poured a cup of tea, opened her laptop, and began drafting a motion for the new case. Outside, the rain fell steadily, a soft, steady sound like the kind of persistence that wears down even the hardest stone. She didn't need the world to call her a genius. She didn't need headlines or applause. What she needed, what she'd always needed, was to know that showing up mattered. That fairness wasn't a gift handed down from above, but something built, day by day, by ordinary people choosing to do the right thing. And as long as there were people like Ms. Ruiz, people with stories that deserved to be heard, she'd keep showing up calmly, competently, completely. Because justice isn't a moment. It's a practice. And she was just getting started.